Now I'm going to show you how to make a bar chart, a bar graph from data in Excel. So I'm going to go over to our data. And this was the same data I used in a previous video about how to make a pie chart. And now we're going to simply change that data over into a bar graph. Now there are a few more options that we can use for bar graphs. And bar graphs are a little bit more robust in terms of the kinds of information, the kinds of data that you can display in a bar graph. But we're going to go ahead and make some bar graphs with this. So this was my original pivot table that I created. And again, I'm going to break the link between the data and the pivot table by pasting the data as values. And then I can do some relabeling. So this is my age category. This is my count. And while it is not catastrophic to include totals in your bar graph the way that it is with a pie chart, generally speaking, there's no reason to include the totals in your graph of any kind. The bars for the totals will always be much taller than the bars for the other categories. And this is especially true if you have a lot of categories. So it just makes the other data more difficult to read. So generally don't include it. Okay, so as making other kinds of charts, we're going to highlight the data that we want to make the chart from. We're going to go to Insert, and I'm going to select, since I know I'm making a bar graph, I'm going to select the bar graph option and show more column charts. Now, one thing to note about Excel, the thing they call column charts in Excel is the typical thing that statisticians think of as a bar graph. What Excel calls a bar graph are the horizontal version of these graphs. And while these graphs are perfectly okay, they can break up the display so they're not all doing the same thing. They are more difficult to read because we're not accustomed to seeing data displayed this way. So I would recommend sticking with a column chart because this is sort of, again, a more typical way of displaying the data. I'm going to select just the default option here. As with previous graphs, the 3D graphs look lovely, but they're very difficult to read, particularly as the data becomes more complex, and just generally speaking, avoid it. Again, we're trying to convey information in a useful and informative way, not necessarily to be artists, but to convey information. And so these 3D graphs, they mess that up. And so we want to go with something simpler, but which does a more reliable job. We will come back and we'll look at this at a different, when we make a second graph. But this one is the default one and we'll just select it. Now, as with the pie chart, the graph that we get is not necessarily always the best way of displaying the data. It's not a good graph in the way that we want it. For instance, the title, this is terrible. I don't want just a generic count as my title. I actually want something more descriptive. So I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to change the name to frequency of ages. Again, the title, it can be open, but it should be descriptive enough that people know what they're looking at. Graphs that have axes need axis titles. And again, we have different ways of adding that information. We can try the quick layouts. We can try some of these other displays, but you can just add it in the chart elements button. And I'm going to go in and change the way that the generic title, these are ages, and these are counts or frequencies. Again, it's important to have these, even if it seems like it's obvious, because the person looking at the graph doesn't know if these are in just raw counts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, or whether these are in thousands or dollars or whatever. Again, you want to tell the reader, of the viewer of the graph, like what information is being displayed. A legend is not necessarily, because we have such simple data. So this is what we would consider a good graph. It has a title, a descriptive title. It's easy to read. The axes are properly labeled, and that's all good. But the problem that we have, the minor problem we have with this data, is that less than 20 is over here and not over here, because Excel alphabetizes this data and it doesn't put them in sort of a logical numerical order. It's not that smart. So what we're going to do is we are going to fix that and use the other bar graph display. So the way that I'm going to fix this, I'm going to copy this structure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to reorder these cells by pointing at the other table. So I don't actually want between 20 and 40 to display first. I want less than 20 to display. So I'm going to point at this label from the previous graph. What should be displayed next is not between 40 and 60, but between 20 and 40. And then this one should not be less than 20. It should be between 40 and 60. Over 60 is in the right spot. Now, these three cells, they're pointing at the table up here, and I want the counts to point at the corresponding values. So I'm going to drag my area over here, and now these counts will update to the correct updated values. So now these will be displayed in a logical numerical order. And now I can make my graph again, and this time I'll try the other bar graph option. More chart. We'll use this one. Now, again, this one is going to come up with a similar issue that we had before. And so I'm going to need to change the chart title. Frequency of ages. I'm going to need to add axis titles. Ages. Now, since this also has a legend, you could conceivably eliminate this bottom axis title if the data was displayed in a way that you liked. I'm going to put count up here. And so this would also be considered a good graph. We have all the categories labeled. Again, this is slightly better because they're in order, in a logical order. Less than 20 is here, then 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and 60 and up. So it's a little easier to see how the data actually works out in the way that makes sense. This isn't important if the data does not have an inherent order, but it does matter when the data is inherently ordered. You may need to help Excel out by reorganizing the data like this. And again, you have lots of options here for the way that the graph is displayed, but you should make sure that it has these main elements, a descriptive title, axis labels, and as the data becomes more complex, a legend is essential.